Okay, everybody. In this section, we are going to be talking about visual literacy. It's an aspect of this course that over time I've realized is an important thing to include as well as the various chapters we're dealing with. I think you all live in an increasingly visual world, and while you take 2 courses in English composition here at West Georgia, you take another course in public speaking, but you're not required to take any kind of course in visual literacy. And as we go along, I think you'll realize more what I mean by that. A quick definition might be that it's important that you learn to analyze your visual environment as you move through it, and really to be critical of it. I think as an informed, educated person, you should be somewhat critical of the things that are in your visual environment. We're going to be looking at 2 portions of 2 documentaries. One is called Consuming Images. It was a Bill Moyers documentary done back in 1990, and another one made about the same time about the writer Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent. To start out, I want you to see this warning page. I think this is actually exactly part of what we're talking about here with this idea of visual literacy. So Noam Chomsky is known for his controversial ideas, and when you bring up a section of manufacturing consent, you get a warning saying that this is potentially inappropriate material. And I really bristle at that idea. I think there's a lot of content on YouTube that's potentially inappropriate, even harmful. When the first time I saw this warning, I thought to myself, what would be the most offensive thing I could think of to dial up on YouTube? And so I typed in public beheading. If we go to public beheading for just a second, I don't want to dwell on this. I'm not going to show you any of it. There are 30,000 results for public beheading, but we don't get a warning about, other than words graphic. Noam Chomsky, you get a warning saying that this could potentially be inappropriate because he's asking you to question your visual environment and who in your world really controls that environment. So this is a pretty short piece. I'm going to just do a few highlights. So for starters, Noam Chomsky is saying that in democracies, people need to be managed, in quotes, in order for the people that are really in power to be able to do what they want to do. This could be seen as a controversial point of view. I happen to think he's got a pretty good idea here. But what he's saying, essentially, is that in democracies, you can't have brute force to control people. And so the way to do that, to control people in a democracy, is to use what he calls propaganda, essentially. It's using persuasive images in our culture to make you believe what people in power want you to believe. Now, bear in mind, this is the late 1990s, and so the example that he's showing here is about the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a controversial idea that was going to create a kind of shield around the United States to defend against Soviet nuclear arms. It would have been incredibly expensive. It never really got off the ground, but there was a lot of kind of sales to the general public to try to get them on board with this idea. And then, of course, he draws a comparison to Nazi Germany, but of course, Nazi Germany was a very different place. That was a military totalitarian state. It wasn't a democracy. He's saying in a place like this that brute force could be used. Adolf Hitler could simply use people like the SS to forcibly make people do what he wanted done. Also notice that this is the movie Will to Power that we watched in Power, Politics, and Glory. So he's referring to the very same work that we studied in class. So he's saying that in a democracy that you really have 2 different groups of people. There's a small class of people that are educated, that participate in decision making. At the time that this was made, he said that it was about 20% of the population, and that the other 80% of the population really were just kind of passive consumers. They were encouraged to not think and to follow orders, as he puts it. And the way that he feels that this is done is through commercial imagery, commercial advertising. Now, one thing to start out talking about this documentary, Consuming Images, is to point out that your awareness of production values and trends and styles. So that little scene we just looked at right there, I think, is a really telling one. I'll go back and play it again, because without really thinking about it, you all are particularly sensitive to these ideas of trend and style and production values, that you know what's appropriate for your time in terms of production values. And when you see something that's older, you are immediately aware of it. You're immediately aware that people's hairstyle and clothing, and then a music video like this, is very out of date and maybe even kind of goofy or embarrassing to watch, to think, wow, how could these people be into that kind of fashion? But I think the very important point to make here is that in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, the things that you think are really cool and hot right now are going to be equally goofy. And another way to put that maybe is that it's harder for you to see that the trends and styles of your time right now are just as fleeting as the styles back then, because you're caught up in it. And here's Neil Postman, author. I read a lot of his work back in the 90s and early 2000s. I think a very important writer about mass media. And of course, one of the things he's talking about here that I think is also very important is this idea of aesthetics versus logic. That when we watch a McDonald's commercial, that it's very difficult to look at the imagery in that commercial and say that there's any truth to it. So his contention here is that we've really entered a realm of aesthetics that's meant to stimulate feeling rather than tell you something that is true or false. You either, as they put it, you either like it or you don't like it. But it's really meant to stimulate feelings in you. And Stuart Ewan, another person that gets interviewed a lot in this documentary, is saying that really that these advertisements are meant to stir primal feelings and to discourage thought, which is actually exactly what Noam Chomsky was saying. If you're part of that 80 or 90% that's not supposed to think, it's that these advertising images are really discouraging you from thinking and relying more on gut feeling. So one of the things that this course is about is showing you examples of great art through history. And Stuart Ewan is saying that, art, especially art related to religious and spiritual practices, was originally meant to be sacred. It was associated with sacred activities. And that in modern culture, we really don't have sacred images anymore. And if we do, they're really associated with the process of selling you something. So it really cheapens the purpose of art in our lives when, movies that may have some meaning, like here again, early 90s examples are Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T., but the importance of that art ends up being associated with an opportunity to sell cookies. And Stuart Ewan is saying that really cheapens art in every way. Another thing that Stuart Ewan is talking about is this idea of celebrity. And we're all very familiar with this, but again, maybe we aren't being as critical of it as we should be. So in our culture, if you are anybody, then it's important that you be seen, right? That you get your image out there. And the more your image is out there, the more clout you have in our culture. What I think is funny is looking at some of these figures from the 1990s that some of them we don't even know who they are anymore. A few of them we do recognize, like Michael Jackson. But others have really passed into obscurity. And so Stuart Ewan's contention here really is that measuring yourself against a famous image like Madonna, that we're all measuring ourselves against an image. But in the process of that, we lose a sense of who we are as a unique individual. Without that backdrop of advertising, you have to wonder who you really are. Stuart Ewan's last point here that we're going to look at is about this idea of democracy of images. And so he's saying that, again, much like what Noam Chomsky is saying, is that as government gets bigger, as corporations get bigger, that really the way that a lot of us are able to exercise our thinking in the world is through the consumption of goods. And of course, we're persuaded to buy those goods through advertising. So this is actually a very similar message, what he's saying, to what Noam Chomsky was saying, that we are less and less able to participate in actual democracy, or we choose not to take part in actual democracy, and that we exercise our supposed freedom by choosing from various consumer goods. And so Stuart Ewan and Noam Chomsky have a very similar kind of message, I think, that he's saying there really no longer is any kind of discussion about citizens and more just about consumers.